Hey guys, today's lesson's a tad bit different than normal. We're going to be starting every Thursday a read aloud. So today what I'm going to do is we have a book and it's called The Stories Julian Tells. And it is actually a story that has a bunch of mini stories inside of it. And we've really been talking a lot about reading books in series and getting to know the characters and seeing how their traits and characteristics follow them through each of their stories. And so what we're going to be doing is today I'm actually going to read an entire story. So bear with me. And then as I read, I'm going to ask you a few questions so you can just kind of be answering those questions in your head and see if your predictions and your questions are correct by the end of the story, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. It says The Stories Julian Tells. Okay, so the story that we're going to start off with today is called The Pudding Like a Night Sea. The Pudding Like a Night on the Sea. So the first thing I want you to think about is the title of this story. They're comparing two different things. The pudding is like the night sea. And I want you to be thinking about that as we read. How in the world and why are they comparing those two things together? So hopefully maybe we can get some answers as we read, okay? All right, and there's not any pictures, it's a chapter book, so just bear with me and listen. It says, I'm going to make something special for your mother, my father said. My mother was out shopping. My father was in the kitchen, looking at the pots and pans and the jars of this and that. What are you going to make, I said. A pudding, he said. My father is a big man with wild black hair. When he laughs, the sun laughs in the window panes. When he thinks, you can almost see his thoughts sitting on the table and chairs. When he is angry, me and my little brother, Huey, shiver to the bottom of our shoes. What kind of pudding will you make? Huey said. A wonderful pudding, my father said. It will taste like a whole raft of lemons. It will taste like a night on the sea. Then he took down a knife and sliced 5 lemons in half. He squeezed the first one. Juice squirted in my eye. Stand back, he said, and squeezed again. The seeds flew out on the floor. Pick up those seeds, Huey, he said. Huey took the broom and swept them up. My father cracked some eggs and put the yolks in a pan and the whites in a bowl. He rolled up his sleeves and pushed back his hair and beat up the yolks. Sugar, Julian, he said, and I poured in the sugar. He went on beating. Then he put in lemon juice and cream and set the pan on the stove. The pudding bubbled as he stirred it fast. Cream splashed on the stove. Wipe that up, Huey, he said, and Huey did. So here's a picture of the boys and his dad. So it's Julian and Huey, and then his dad, and they're all helping them make this pudding in the kitchen. It was hot by the stove. My father loosened his collar and pushed at his sleeves. The stuff in the pan was getting thicker and thicker. He held the heater and beater up high in the air. Just right, he said, and sniffed in the smell of the pudding. He whipped the egg whites and mixed them into the pudding. The pudding looked softer and lighter than air. Done, he said, and he washed all the pots. Okay, so my first question is on that part is, how are they acting? How are the brothers Huey and Julian acting so far in the story? Okay, so just be thinking about that. And we'll visit that question in a second. Okay, so he washed all of the pots, splashing water on the floor, and wiped the counter so fast his hair made circles around his head. Perfect, he said. Now I'm going to take a nap. If something important happens, bother me. If nothing important happens, don't bother me. And the pudding is for your mother, so leave the pudding alone. What do you guys think might happen? Okay, make a prediction inside your head. What do you think those boys are gonna do? Do you think they're gonna leave the pudding alone and be good boys? Or do you think they're gonna get curious? All right, he went into the living room and was asleep in a minute. Sitting straight up in his chair, Huey and I guarded the pudding. Oh, it's a wonderful pudding, Huey said. With waves on top like the ocean, I said. I wonder how it tastes, Huey said. Leave that pudding alone, I said. If I just put my finger in it, there, I'll know how it tastes, Huey said. And he did it. You did it, I said. How does it taste? It tastes like a whole raft of lemons, he said. It tastes like a night on the sea. You've made a hole in the pudding, I said. But since you did it, I'll have to taste. And it tastes like a whole night of lemons. It tasted like floating at sea. It's such a big pudding, Huey said. It can't hurt to have a little more. Since you took more, I'll have to have more too, I said. That was a bigger lick than I took, Huey said. I think I'm going to have more again. Whoops, I said. You put your whole hand in it, Huey. Look at the pudding you spilled on the floor. I'm going to have to clean it up now, I said. And I took the rag from the sink. That's not really clean, Huey said. It's the best I can do, I said. Look at the pudding, Huey said. It looks like craters on the moon. We have to smooth this over, I said. So it looks the way it did before. So let's go get some spoons. And we evened the top of the pudding with spoons. And while we evened it, we ate some more. There isn't much left, I said. We were supposed to leave the pudding alone, Huey. We'd better get away from here, I said. We ran into our bedroom and crawled underneath the bed. After a long time, we heard my father's voice. Come into the kitchen, dear, he said. I have something for you. Why? What is it? My mother said, out in the kitchen. Under the bed, Huey and I pressed ourselves to the wall. Look, said my father out in the kitchen, a wonderful pudding. Where's the pudding? My mother said. Where are you, boys? My father said. His voice went through every crack of the corner of the house. We felt like two leaves in a storm. Where are you? I said. My father's voice was booming. Huey whispered to me, I'm scared. He heard my father walking slowly through the rooms. Huey, he called. Julian. He could see at his feet. He was coming into our room. He lifted the bedspread, and there was his face and his eyes like black lightning. He grabbed us by the legs and pulled us up. Stand up, he said, and we stood up. What do you have to tell me? He said. We went outside, Huey said, and we came back in. The pudding was gone. Then why were you hiding under the bed? My father said. We didn't say anything. We just looked at the floor. I can tell you one thing, he said. There is going to be some beating here now. There's going to be some whipping. The curtains at the window were shaking. Huey was holding my hands. Go into that kitchen, my father said, right now. We went into the kitchen. Come here, Huey, my father said. Huey walked towards him, his hands behind his back. See these eggs, his father said. He cracked them and put the yolks in the pan, set them on the counter. He stood by the chair in the counter. Stand up here, he said to Huey. Huey stood up by the chair. Now it's time for your beating, my father said. Huey started to cry. His tears fell in with the egg yolks. Take this, my father said. His father handed him the egg beater. Now beat those eggs, he said. I want it to be a good beating. Oh, Huey said. He stopped crying and started to beat them. Now you, Julian, stand here, my father said. I stood on a chair by the table. I hope you're ready for some whipping. I didn't answer. I was afraid to say yes or no. Here, he said, and he sat the egg whites in front of me. I want these whipped and whipped well. Yes, sir, I said, and started whipping. My father watched us. My mother came into the kitchen and watched us. After a while, Huey said, this is hard work. That's too bad, my father said. You're not done. And he added sugar and cream and lemon juice to Huey's pan and put it on the stove. Huey went on beating. My arms hurt from whipping, I said. That's too bad. Your whipping is not done. So I whipped, and Huey beat and beat. Hold that beater in the air, Huey, my father said. See, my father said, a good pudding stays with the beater. It's thick enough now, you're done. And then he turned to me. Let's see those egg whites, Julian, he said. They were puffed up and fluffy. Congratulations, Julian, he said. Your whipping is done. He mixed the egg whites into the pudding himself. Then he passed the pudding to my mother. A wonderful pudding, he said. Would you like some, boys? No, thank you, he said. She picked up a spoon. Why, this tastes like a whole raft of lemons, she said. This tastes like a night on the sea. All right, so that is the end of our first story in the Stories Julian Tells. Next week, we will be reading another one in this series. and we're going to learn a little bit more about Julian and Huey and his father and see if we can see any common characteristics and traits from these characters in our stories. All right, guys.